I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I welcome you all here tonight. It's great to see a crowd gathered together for a civil liberties cause. So much through the year we think that everything is against us and there are not enough supporters, and here you are tonight, leaders of our community supporting the cause of civil liberties and human rights. And what a wonderful collection of people you are. Life members of the Council for Civil Liberties, Michael Kirby and Cameron Murphy. I'm going to mention that Michael Kirby is mentioned in the second edition of the Council for Civil Liberties newsletter, issued in early 1964. Michael was then organising legal representation for students who were arrested at a protest outside the US consulate in Sydney. And haven't times changed? Not since then. We have members of the Australian Parliament and New South Wales Parliament, current and former. Welcome. Meredith Bergman, special welcome to you. Senator Lee Rhiannon, a sole Australian citizen, one of the few senators who is only Australian citizen, it seems. Current and former judges of the High Court of Australia, the Federal Court, the Supreme Court of New South Wales. I have to say Michael Kirby fits into a number of those categories, but there are other current and former judges here. Welcome. David Bennett, former Solicitor General, special welcome to you. Senior counsel, future judges. And there must be a number of those with you, with us here tonight. A special welcome to Bret Walker, our guest speaker tonight. I am so looking forward to this speech. Last week, I was at a Justice Symposium in Melbourne for 2 days, led by David Neal and former Solicitor General Justin Gleeson, and Immanuel Kant was on our reading list. We had to work through the tortured text to understand categorical imperatives and so forth, and it will be fabulous to hear the speech tonight which explains the relevance of that theory of justice to some of the most important issues currently before us. We have tonight Osman Faruqi, a young journalist who, of course, this week is particularly famous for his defamation proceedings against Mark Latham. Free speech and racial vilification are at the heart of those proceedings, although of course on opposing sides. So it will be very interesting. I don't think Civil Liberties is going to back one side against the other on that one. I'd like to mention particularly we have a table here tonight of people from the Affinity Intercultural Foundation, strong supporters of freedoms and civil liberties in Australia and elsewhere, and particularly at the moment, given that what is going on in Turkey, they are an important organisation representing Turkish people interested in freedom. There is an organisation in Australia of victims of Turkish oppression, and the Affinity organisation is very welcome here tonight. As Pauline mentioned, there are so many issues that are before us constantly, affronts on our freedoms and civil rights, the counter-terrorism legislation, which keeps on being rolled out in tranche after tranche after tranche, represents a continual attack on our freedoms. And as Pauline said, without a counterbalancing human rights bill and charter, the Parliament is free to take away our rights, and there is little that can be done about it. Just last month, another round of outrageous legislation was announced, and what we all here need to recognise is that the major political parties are all for it, and people like this council are the only ones standing up against it. And so when the media were reporting on the new legislation, I think I was on 5 different television networks, and I spent the entire day doing media, because there are so few organisations prepared to speak out on these outrageous attacks on our freedoms. As Pauline mentioned, this week in New South Wales, legislation went through allowing detention, imprisonment for things not that people have done, but what people might do in the future. And of course, we have an extensive system in Australia of administrative detention, not just of asylum seekers, but also former visa holders whose visas have been cancelled on the say-so of ASIO. And ASIO has this incredible power to make assessments in secret, without fair process, unreviewable, which lead automatically to visa cancellations and detention, and there is very, very little that can be done. On the bright side, we are trying to find ways of dealing with. We've had 2 cases in the federal court this year, which are mentioned in the annual report that, of ASIO that was tabled in Parliament last month, where we had some measure of victory in the federal court, although the inevitable result is that ASIO just carries out the assessment again, and the person remains deprived of their freedom and connection with their Australian families. It is disgraceful. It's not all doom and gloom. We've had some successes this year. The High Court struck down the Tasmanian anti-protest laws, and the New South Wales anti-protest laws, which are modelled on them, will undoubtedly fail as well. And most recently, the Australian people, when given the chance to express a view, have voted overwhelmingly for marriage equality. The Council for Civil Liberties has been a campaigner for marriage equality since I was first involved 20 years ago, and finally it is going to happen. And there might even be an interesting side effect or consequence. We might even next year get a debate about whether the rights in the ICCPR, or at least some of them, ought to be more thoroughly protected in Australian law. And it's an opportunity for the Australian people to say, well, if you're going to protect some rights, you shouldn't do that in isolation. You should protect all of the rights in the ICCPR. So let's hope that next year we have a debate which might lead to a Bill of Rights, a proper Bill of Rights for Australia. And so those are just some of the issues which concern us. There are so many more. Tonight, it's a chance for us to enjoy each other's company, be exposed to the fabulous speeches from Michael Kirby and Bret Walker, and to donate money to the Council for Civil Liberties.
It's wonderful to be here. This is actually my kind of audience, sincerely. I mean, you are, by your motivation, by your being here, you are sort of my kind of person, and I'm your kind of person. Because when I was asked to do this onerous job, which is essentially just to introduce Bret Walker, I said, okay, I will do that, but I insist on paying my own way. I am not here as a freeloader. I paid my dinner, and you've got to dig deep and dig often. We are not here just to have a big nosh up. We are here to raise money for the CCL. So don't forget that at any moment during these remarks. I agree with the President that a very significant moment in the last year has been the postal survey. I didn't agree with the postal survey. I didn't agree with it at all. I didn't agree with doing something exceptional to LGBTIQ citizens in Australia and having their legal rights, their equal legal rights, determined not in the Parliament, which is what our Constitution provides, but determined in a vote of the majority of people in a plebiscite. It was exceptional, it was not constitutional in the sense that it wasn't the way we normally do things, and the Parliament of the Commonwealth, when it had a chance, twice rejected allowing outsiders to intrude into the Australian legislative process. So I didn't agree with it at all. And I was told tonight that by one person who is here that her nephew had felt that he was humiliated and denigrated by the process of hearing things that were said about him that he thought we'd got over in Australia. Well, we haven't got over it. 38% of our fellow citizens haven't got over it, and churches haven't got over it. Astonishing, isn't it? When I went down to Wollongong recently to give some lectures, all along the road down to Wollongong, there are churches, and they all had these signs up. It's okay to say no. Well, I don't think it is okay to say no. I think it is against civil liberties of fellow citizens. Anyway, from that horrible process, a silver lining emerged, and the silver lining was the fact that the great majority of the citizens of our country did the right thing. And that's actually something joyous in a way, because that wouldn't have happened even 10 years ago. That wouldn't have happened, maybe even 5 years ago. Something has happened, and it does tend to show that people in Australia are not, as is said, the conservative majority, but people who do believe in a fair go for fellow citizens, and so that is a good thing. But it's also a CCL thing, because I'm old enough to remember the celebrated occasion. It was 1977, I think, or thereabouts. It was after the Rann government came into office in 1976. And Neville Rann had been a notable member of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, and he was at the dinner, and he was booed and he was heckled at the Council for Civil Liberties dinner, and that is what led him in 1978 to introduce the criminal laws that got rid of the in 1984, I think it was, to get rid of the criminal laws. It took a time, but it was done, and a recent book that I've read said that it was the attitude at the CCL dinner which stuck in his mind and determined him to get rid of it. So the Council for Civil Liberties did some important things on the way to the 15th of November 2017. I think back on the days I used to attend the CCL dinner meetings. They were every month They were on a Tuesday, and they were in a very particularly shabby office in Pitt Street, and we would get together. And the people who would join in those meetings were Robert Hope, later my colleague on the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, a most distinguished and able lawyer, Bob St John, later a judge of the Federal Court of Australia, James Staples, a great and unique Australian, and someone who had a great faith in the rule of law, but the rule of law didn't always have a great faith in James Staples. Marcel Pyle, QC, a most elegant and sophisticated lawyer. He became a judge at the District Court. Tab Lynham, who was a solicitor and very faithful in acting for people who had cases before the courts. Gordon, otherwise known as Bunter Johnson, who was a most amusing and witty man who would give up every day of his life if he got a chance for cases for the CCL. Ken Buckley, Berenice Buckley, Neville Rand. Ken Buckley definitely deserved, and Berenice. They were a marvellous duo. They gave up a tremendous lot for the Council for Civil Liberties, and I honour them in these remarks. Caroline Simpson, she was there in those early days. So it's appropriate that we should mention them. You know, it's significant that many of those were barristers, and many of the barristers became judges. It's not a bad country, it's not a bad jurisdiction when you leaven the rather conservative people who normally become judges with people, if they wish to accept appointment, who have been the members of the Council for Civil Liberties. And I was told by the President tonight, I asked who are the barristers who are now members of the CCL and members of the committee and giving up their time. I mean, at our top table is Bret Walker and my brother David, who became a judge of the Supreme Court and Secretary of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties. Give him a big hand, he's my brother. No, you don't clap yourself. And Nicholas Kirby, who's a barrister, but the President told me that there are not many barristers now. Now, that's not good. That is not good. You must have people who can put on their wig or not their wig and go into court and fight the cases, and who have the imagination to see that there is a case. I mean, if you don't have that, if you don't have the experience, then that's a weakness in the institution. So I think you should start getting out the lists of barristers, and you should be inviting them and seeking to get more of them onto the committee. The other thing that needs to be said is that the CCL often saw things ahead of others. It saw the Aboriginal issue in the law. You know, when I was at law school, I never raised my hand once and asked, why are the native title rights of Aboriginals not respected in Australia? Never put my hand up. I never put my hand up and asked, why do women take their domicile from their husband instead of vice versa? And I certainly never put my hand up and asked, why do we criminalise gays and put them in jail for their sexuality? So, you need good lawyers and you need good citizens to support the work of the CCL. And I honour the achievements of the past, but it's much more important that we start planning for the achievements of the future and ask ourselves, if we didn't see these issues ourselves immediately back in the 1960s, what are the issues we are not seeing today and not asking questions about? We must never be content with the state of civil liberties, and by what I've heard tonight and what I think we will hear from Bret Walker, there's plenty of work to be done. Now, Bret Walker is a most brilliant lawyer. He was born in 1954, which is the year I was at my high school, about to enter my final year, and Terry Cole was the vice captain of the school in that year, 1954, at Fort Street High School. Thank you. Bret Walker's father was an Anglican minister, and he had the great joy, I'm sure, of the canticles in the Anglican service of the Book of Common Prayer every Sunday, and I think it enters your soul, and I think it entered his manner of expressing himself, the beauty of Cranmer's language. I'm not sure that he has continued with that loyalty to the church, but it certainly is there, as you will hear in his manner of speaking, with clarity and beauty. He went to the King's School and from there to the University of Sydney, where he took the degrees of BA, LLB. He was admitted to the bar in 1979, and he took chambers in St James's Chambers, where my brother, whose chambers were exactly opposite, says he would look over there and there were no books in the chambers. There was pottery and works of art. Books must have been hidden in some faraway place, because back in early times you had to have the books. But he also was most unusual that in his conferences he would not take notes. He has a fantastic memory. A number of lawyers I've known have got fantastic memories. Justice McHugh, who didn't go to law school and trained himself, read every volume of the Commonwealth Law Reports, and he can say that a particular point is dealt with on a particular page of a particular volume, and he has this photographic or eidetic image that can tell that it's there. And Justice Handley had that same skill. It's a rare skill. It's a sort of photographic memory. And I think Bret Walker, who takes no notes, would have that skill. In 1993, he was appointed senior counsel. I was then the president of the Court of Appeal, and I had the pleasure of welcoming him to the court at that time in his silken robe. 1996, he became governor of the Law Foundation. 1997, president of the Law Council of Australia. 2000, a member of a number of the Law Reform Commission advisory committees, but also the director of the Sydney Writers' Festival. In 2001, he became the president of the New South Wales Bar Association. In 2002, he began a number of committees of inquiry into the national parks, into the Institute of Forensic Sciences, and into casino control. He, in 2007, became a special commissioner on the Sydney ferries issues at that time. In 2009, he received the President of the Law Council of Australia's medal for service to the law, and he then in 2011 became the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor of Australia, a most important job for the defence of civil liberties, monitoring all the flood of legislation that deals with national security. When I went to the Attorney General's Department in Canberra on my appointment as chairman of the Law Reform Commission in 1975, I looked around at that meagre group. But when I went more recently, it is enormous. It is enormous. There are now literally thousands of people working in the Attorney General's Department dealing with matters of national security, policing. So it's a changed institution. and we need guardians to look after it. In summing up, I would say, first of all, our guest speaker tonight is a top silk and greatly respected in constitutional law and in business law. He's in the manuals as a top business lawyer, but he has that skill which is absolutely essential, and I always told my associates this: to be a top civil libertarian lawyer and advocate, you have to know how to argue black letter law. If you don't know how to argue that, you are all heart, and frankly, you can be a menace, because you need people who know the techniques and skills to see a problem, to see an issue, to see a solution, and to argue it. And that is what our speaker tonight has. He was always prepared, and he was unflappable. My brother David told me that he was presiding in a trial, a defamation case, and suddenly an important and rather expected to be lengthy witness didn't turn up. And so the question arose whether Mr. Walker could deal with the cross-examination of a very important witness without notice. And such is his memory that he was then able to conduct that cross-examination with fine, refined and precise references to pages, to documents, to information, to statements, that is truly remarkable. Most people work up their cross-examinations. It's not inspiration, it's perspiration. But Bret Walker had it all in his head with his phenomenal memory. And he's also a great friend of the dragon dictate. He's one of these people who speaks, and I'm not too bad myself, in rounded sentences. There are full stops, there are commas, there are colons and semicolons. And this is a talent which you are now going to witness. We're fortunate tonight to have one of the most able, talented and well-motivated lawyers of this country, Bret Walker, Senior Counsel.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think I have Michael to thank for those remarks. We'll see. How or why would I want to link the person to whose work reference is vital if you wish to discuss in normative terms the ethics of political science, ethical politics if you like, and a current minister of our current government to whose activities no such reference will ever be appropriate. And I want to start in Germany. And I have two stories, both as it happens, about aeroplanes. At least they weren't boats. The first happened 40 years ago. 1977, in the then Federal Republic that we called West Germany, was a very bad time indeed. Emergencies, violence, and the politics of terrorism affecting society in a way that no Australian government in peacetime has ever faced to any comparable degree. The Red Army faction, the Baader-Meinhof gang, specialised in the practice of politics by violence and killing of a kind which in Germany one might have hoped would have been eliminated after 1945. There had been, in about 1975, some kidnappings of officials, people in civil society, which had produced, by way of the hostage and threat of violence, the release of convicted terrorists. They were flown with some money to the then Republic of Yemen. One of them later came back and in 1977 kidnapped the president of what I'll call in English the German Business Forum, Hans Martin Schleyer. It was a very large event, widely publicised, no media blackout. And the demands included not only the release of yet more convicted terrorists, but other matters of a kind which showed that there had been a magnification of effect, an appreciation of the leverage available by that kind of violence. The government, Helmut Schmidt's government, decided to stand firm in that ghastly web of international terrorism that existed then. It's not new today. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine took on, as it were, a referral job and hijacked a passenger aircraft carrying German holidaymakers home, I think, from Mallorca. They killed the pilot, the captain. And they too publicised their usual kind of demands for the German government to release the German terrorists and, for good measure, of course, some Palestinian prisoners as well. And the government stood firm. Herr Schleyer's son realised his father was going to be killed in a ghastly kind of reality show. He tried secretly to pay the ransom in money that might have been sufficient to free his father, save his father. Inadvertent publicity scotched that possibility. The government, in any event, did not want to deal with terrorists. And so he sued. He sued in a court which is only superficially similar to our High Court, only superficially similar to the United States Supreme Court, the Bundesverfassungsgericht that sits in Karlsruhe, that's not frightened of political questions, although it has been, sometimes excessively, commentators have thought, very deferential to the executive. And the son of the hostage said to the court, there are a number of provisions of what the Germans modestly call the Grundgesetz, the basic law, said in its terms to be provisional, but probably now cemented by way of it being acceded to upon reunification by all the states of the former East Germany. They said there are various provisions of the Grundgesetz, in particular Article 1.1, that speaks of the inviolable nature of human dignity. That means you, the government, should do more than you are doing, and preferably you should do something so as to strike a deal with these wretched criminals to free my father, to save his life. The court received the formal complaint about 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, convened a hearing at 9:30 p.m. that day, delivered a judgment at 5:45 in the morning on the Sunday. And they said no, for reasons I'll come to in a moment. The government does not have to do what you, the grieving son, seeks for the father. I think it was the very next day that a number of the Baader-Meinhof prisoners, including Andreas Baader himself, suicided or at least that is the inquest's finding. And the day after that, on the basis that that constituted something in the nature of murder in the warped view of the terrorists, Hans-Martin Schleyer was shot in the head, including by one of the terrorists who'd been freed 2 years before, when a bargain had been reached with hostage takers. Now, what's that got to do, you ask, about the inviolable nature of human dignity? Well, I am coming to the categorical imperative, and quite seriously. And one aspect of the categorical imperative, of course, is that it is a starting point of ethical thinking about the social relations which are politics, that none of us uses any of the rest of us as instruments or means to an end. And of course, the hostage takers are doing just that. To be taken hostage is to be taken as an instrument or means for ends. And that is one of the philosophical explanations of why hostage taking is a monstrous crime. Much more recently, 2006, the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe received another complaint from a number of different groups. They included the associations of the flight crew staff, what was called in German, I can't reproduce, the cockpit crew staff, flight crew as we'd call them, and a number of other groups who are affected by the conduct of safe aviation. And there was an act, which I think without any intended irony was called the Aviation Security Act. Now, by 2006, as you know, the Twin Towers had been destroyed by the use of 2 passenger airlines as weapons, in a rather gruesome image during argument in the Bundesverfassungsgericht. The hapless passengers, innocents as they're called in the jargon, had been turned actually into weapons. They had been weaponised, not only physically but for propaganda as well. And the German Bundestag had, by huge majority, so bipartisan or multi-partisan, had agreed to enact laws, had enacted laws, which had what appeared to be, and really was, a very carefully graded set of lawful response by the military in liaison with the police in German airspace when something of that kind, namely the hijacking of an aeroplane, feared or declared or threatened to become a weapon, and the German public and the security of people in German territory was thereby threatened. It was an ascending, familiar, proportionate response notion, which had at its apex the possibility of the Air Force shooting the passenger airliner down. There are, I think, no commentators at the time who thought that being able to shoot an airliner down meant anything really than the virtually certain death of everybody on the aeroplane. The government put a nuanced argument, which I will no doubt unintentionally travesty by summary, but it included a familiar utilitarian notion that the several hundred, perhaps 200, on the airliner were doomed anyhow. Their lifespans were to be measured in hours, whereas the lifespans of perhaps the thousands in the populated areas which might have been the targets of the aeroplane under the control of the terrorist, you could look forward, of course, to much more. You'll see an unpleasant quantitation involved. But being unpleasant doesn't make it unlawful, because part of the art or challenge of government will obviously be dealing with the so-called wicked problems to which there are no happy answers, but to which there must be an answer. The court preferred the argument of the plaintiffs, the various claimants. And they did it in terms which the sage of Königsberg would have recognised. Because the categorical imperative, in two senses that I'll come to in a moment, can be seen virtually explicitly on the pages of the reasons. The state has no right to render these people, who are victims of crime, objects for state purpose. They are not to be regarded as instruments for the end of preventing whatever mayhem is intended by the terrorist on the ground. Now, of course, one thing you will have noticed about the situation that the plaintiffs had brought to the court in Karlsruhe was that the death of the passengers was certain if the lawfully authorised military force was engaged. Whereas the death of anybody on the ground was by no means certain, as the tremendous act of self-sacrificing, I stress self-sacrificing, heroism, we think, of the passengers on the third aeroplane that crashed in Pennsylvania in 2001 will remind us. The categorical imperative comes in a primary form that we should act in our relations with others on the basis of a rule or maxim, a principle, that we can think should be universally applied. Some people have thought, I think too glibly, that the English translation is do as you would be done by. I think we need to understand, particularly with governments that don't always have decisions made by people who do identify with the plurality of the population, that it's not do as you would be done by, it's do as you would have you and everyone else done by, and everyone else done by. Now, a slightly elaborated but much more immediate form of the categorical imperative is an obvious one, and I've already mentioned it. And it follows from the principle that you should act only in accordance with the rule that you can universalise, that you would never ever use fellow inhabitants of the earth, let alone your fellow citizens, as instruments for some governmental or personal project. There are many ways in which the English can paraphrase the German that I can't reproduce. But the familiar English locution, of course, is that people are never a means, they can only ever be an end. Or perhaps slightly teased out, the welfare and interests of people, in order that they have their dignity as people, is an end. You may not cause them to suffer as a means to produce some advantage for others. Now, it does seem to me that at that point, a philosopher whose work is still read, who is still tremendously important for not just Germanic and other continental, but I think all civilised legal systems in their wrestling with the normative justifications of their rules, Immanuel Kant, we come to ask, how did we end up with enacted legislation and executive policy and daily administration of the system that has just had today something that lends itself to such sad and terrible language as the facility at Manus having been cleaned up. How did we get there? Well, we got there by a policy that renders it a little unfair for my subtitle to have picked out Peter Dutton. Only a little unfair. He does render himself egregious in the relish with which he justifies what decency would expect to be always uttered regretfully, even if you are a partisan in favour of it. But it's a little unfair because it's not just his colleagues in government, and I don't mean those bound by cabinet solidarity, I mean those who vote on the backbenches for the government. And it is also the opposition, at least with a capital O. Indeed, the opposition with a capital O, when they were in government, can probably be credited as the true authors of the policy. But by now, such enthusiasm has been given to the project that, however numerous our ministers and their parliamentary supporters, who may be attributed as the authors, what matters is that we, as members of the polity, as members of the society of which the Commonwealth is the polity, need to reflect in terms which do go back to what Immanuel Kant had to say about such matters. What would he say? What would any of the prophets or divinities of the three great religions of the book say about referring to the treatment of people who are either asylum seekers or, having been asylum seekers, are now accepted as refugees with convention protection, being held in places and under conditions designed, not accidentally produced, designed and executed for a declared purpose. That declared purpose being, as recently as yesterday, you could hear it again from a minister, deterrence. It is, I think, the most barefaced and revolting instrumentalism that I have heard from a non-authoritarian or non-totalitarian government while I've been alive. I practice a bit of criminal law. I'm used to the idea of deterrence. But that's not instrumental in criminal law because it's an element in the sentencing of a person for his or her offending. And it is understood that a civilised view of sentencing, classically expounded in Veen No. 2 by the High Court, necessarily involves consideration of deterrence. I personally happen to have lost faith in its social reality, but it is nonetheless appropriately part of the jurisprudence about sentencing. That's not instrumental, and it's not instrumental because it's understood the person must be punished, it will be done in public, there will be something in the nature of a lesson, maybe for that person, maybe for others. At least that's the hope. But the idea that you would select people who haven't, under the rule of law, made themselves susceptible to punishment and visit upon them adversity in order to teach some lesson and mould other people's conduct is to use them as a means and to abrogate their human dignity as an end. And there should be no mistaking the deliberateness of this as a policy, revealing the intellectual and, I think, moral bankruptcy of those who advised, promoted and reinforced the scheme. The responsibility is not just the parliamentarians. How can you seriously say that it is the right thing to make asylum seekers and acknowledged refugees suffer in order that others not undertake the same risks as that first group took on their way to being so scurvily received by Australia? If we really believed, if we as a society really believed this was about preventing drownings, and of course the drownings have to be prevented, if at all possible, just as a matter of mercy and charity, then we wouldn't be stopping boats, we'd be sending boats. We'd be sending good boats and good crews. And better still, we'd be doing something about the conditions which drive these people to have the well-founded fear of persecution, which leads to them getting convention protection in the first place. And it wouldn't just be sneers at New Zealand to spend their money in Indonesia at peril of endangering the Anzac relation. What nonsense. What a juvenile and impolite threat. It would be us spending vastly greater sums of money than New Zealand was offering, if you like, at source. Stop obsessing about getting rid of the pull factor and start doing something, perhaps at the UN, reforming the Security Council and its monstrous veto system, about the push factor. But instead, what we have is a policy that says we will make this as miserable as possible for this group that has done no wrong, neither seeking asylum nor becoming recognised as a refugee. With convention protection is, of course, a wrong, except in a very distorted moral universe. And we will do so in order to make it even more a miserable calculation of fear of persecution and risk of the voyage ahead for those who are in like position. What an astonishing reversal from the near universal global acceptance of a duty to assist the afflicted and miserable that we saw in the aftermath of World War II. Now, I don't suggest that these are simple problems. They are wicked problems. And neither do I suggest that we need a court like the Bundesverfassungsgericht to practice pretty open politics in its decision-making by reference to Article 1.1 of the Grundgesetz. As has been remarked before tonight, we don't have anything like that, either the court or the Constitution. And I don't think, with my cultural inflexibility, I don't think I would like to see that descend upon us, at least certainly not suddenly. What we do have, however, is the vote. Not all of us, at least for the lower house, will be able to vote for any candidate who has any realistic prospect of doing anything about these matters. And of course, no Commonwealth election should ever, I hope, at least in peacetime, be a single issue election. But at least a group committed to civil liberties and those whom we can influence by conversation, discussion and persuasion, at least serious thought, sounds like a Mitsubishi ad, at least serious thought, please consider asking the candidates, either directly or through joining United Voices in public, asking why is it that it's thought proper for a civilised nation to use other people as mere instruments without respecting their individual human dignity? And what can be done to get Australia back on a track where, believe it or not, we acceded to a treaty that had in its Article 34 a duty to facilitate the naturalisation and assimilation of refugees. When did you last hear discussion by any politician about Article 34? Correctly, I think their calculation is that the tabloid overseers of public opinion would destroy the political fortunes of any party that seriously proposed that we comply with those almost defunct obligations. And it may be that following the now, thank God, distant days of the 1940s and a shattered Asia and Europe, maybe it is appropriate for the world to revisit the Convention and to take a totally fresh view at the dignity of individuals miserably driven from their homes, from that idealistically conveyed by Article 34 of the Convention. But it won't happen. Nothing will happen unless we do something which is our native substitute for taking a case to Karlsruhe. We can't take cases to Karlsruhe, literally or figuratively, but we can vote. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have been given the unenviable task of moving a vote of thanks to both Michael Kirby and Bret Walker. Let me mention each in turn. The history of Michael Kirby that he allowed to be read to us was just a part of the story. Michael Kirby has been a champion of human rights for so long, in so many places, in so many ways, and with such effect, that I think we are so indebted to him that it is really very difficult to thank him appropriately for what he has contributed. Almost enough said about him, but he has reminded us of some of the history of the Council for Civil Liberties and some of the luminaries of the Council over those years, of some of the challenges that have been faced, of some of the results that have been achieved, and of some of the challenges that remain. And I think reminders of that sort are important, and we need to have them made to us from time to time. So thank you, Michael, for doing that. I think it would be fair to say that Bret Walker has lived up to the introduction that Michael gave for him. And I will move to ask you to thank Bret in the usual way in a moment. He has highlighted, as he describes it, a wicked problem, and the ways in which our government has sought to address that problem. Really, I think, just making things worse, as I'm sure we would all agree. There must be a better way. May I put in a plug here for the latest book by Julian Burnside, Watching Out. Have a look for that book and have a look at what he says about the refugee issue, which of course is one very dear to his heart as well. But I take absolutely nothing away from what Bret has said tonight. And the great shame of it at a national level is that the consequences of this conduct have been sanctioned, I use that word a little bit loosely, by the High Court. The High Court has held that in certain circumstances where a visa is refused to a refugee, perhaps on an ASIO assessment, it is lawful for that person to be held in detention for life in the worst possible circumstances that can be devised. That is the effect of two judgments of the High Court of Australia. That's what we've got to. And why has the High Court held that? Because that is the law. And judges must apply constitutionally valid law. So that's not an escape. And I think it's a very bad situation, as I'm sure you would all agree, that we've got ourselves into. Bret has also given us reminders of why we do what we do. He's given us an idea of the challenges, or some of the challenges, that lie ahead. And we shouldn't shirk those challenges. We need to take action in any way we can, even if it is by voting, if that's the last action that we have to us. When I saw Bret's topic for tonight, I'm sure, like everybody else, I was a little bit challenged. Let me remind you of the topic. The people are not instruments. I think that came across very well. Or Peter Dutton, whose name was not mentioned by Bret, is not Immanuel Kant. I think we now see why that topic was addressed in that way. And I want to leave you with a quotation from Kant, which I think points in some way to the future for us all. And it's this: seek not the favour of the multitude. It is seldom got by honest and lawful means. But seek the testimony of few, and number not voices, but weigh them. And these are voices in this room and in the Council for Civil Liberties that deserve very great weight. So keep it up.